This 1918 jumper prime was born from the horrors of the 1918 influenza pandemic. People with this respiratory disease would end up with a flooded pair of lungs. Victims were drowning in their own fluid. They would have pale blue skin, cough up blood, develop fever, and severe pneumonia. You may think, it's such a terrible virus that must have caused this. But was it the virus alone that caused so much damage? The pathogen that caused the 1918 influenza pandemic is called the H1n1 virus, known for the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase proteins on its surface. If you compare the deaths by seasonal influenza yearly by the influenza pandemic in 1918, it's a mere fraction of it, just 0.4% of the number of deaths caused by influenza in 1918. That is, if it were 50 million deaths. Although some researchers argue that the Spanish flu killed 100 million people. So by comparing recent influenza deaths with the mortality rate of 1918, it is manifest. The 1918 pandemic was devastating. But why? Why were the chances of survival so narrow at that time? Was it because the H1n1 virus was more virulent, or were the conditions people were living in to blame? I believe that the Spanish flu of 1918 was significant mainly because of the conditions at that particular time. These factors resulted in a deadly and historical pandemic. It could not have been the H1n1 virus alone that caused so many deaths. The methodology that I'll use to draw conclusions can be classified into the following 3 steps. In Philadelphia, they ran out of coffins. Police would collect corpses draped in sackcloths and blood-stained sheets, left on porches and sidewalks. Bodies were piling up in wagons, their motionless limbs sticking out from under the sheets. It was a horrifying scene. Deaths caused by influenza instantaneously spiked. It was an abrupt change. It's not likely that that virus could have caused so much damage by itself. After the pandemic, the mortality rate decreased. Remember, time was changing, and so was technology. In 1928, penicillin was discovered. So from there, deaths decreased even more. And eventually vaccines and antivirals were developed. So the number of deaths by influenza significantly reduced. However, if we were to estimate, it is quite possible that without the advancement of medicine and technology, the number of deaths would be heightened, even in the 2000s. But even with this estimate, the pandemic of 1918 would still be topping the charts. Why? Because the world was at war. World War I may have increased the destruction caused by influenza in 1918. In 1917, the flu was on the rise. It's not apparent where it originated, but since troops were on the move, the flu which they carried decided to tag along. Now, let's summarize some significant factors caused by World War, which contribute to the disastrous pandemic. Many leaders either denied or ignored the presence of influenza, even though doctors urged them, claiming that there was an epidemic. But the leaders were just like, whatever. So with less people working to fight influenza, containment of the virus was not anticipated. On the other hand, military doctors ordered lung samples, reports, and any account on medication to fight influenza. But it was all a strictly preserved secret. Moving on to social factors, there was much poverty during this time, so not everyone could afford proper health measures. Also, when soldiers were coming home, Armistice Day invoked a celebration. With so many soldiers on one ship and some infected with influenza, it's clear that they were bringing home a terrible virus, especially after it mutated. Speaking of mutation, the war itself may have mutated the virus. When the Germans launched their spring offensive on the French, British, and American allies, they used mustard gas, which is known to cause genetic mutation. The battlefield was filled with this chemical. Oh, and, by the way, the German soldiers had the flu. So with the flu also on the battlefield, genetic mutation was more likely to occur. But hold on a minute. The mutation could also have happened if a soldier was infected with 2 different strains of the flu. If they merged, it could have resulted in this ghastly variant. Either way, since troops who were infected with the flu were constantly traveling to different places and meeting other people, this mutation would have happened with or without mustard gas, because the war made it possible. Okay, so we've covered war. Let's talk about the people who were immunocompromised. Remember the trenches? Those were highly unsanitary. These weakened and wounded soldiers were exposed to tons of dirt and perhaps bacteria while in the trenches, and this made them highly susceptible to influenza. Regarding biological factors, the 1918 pandemic was a syndemic. That means there wasn't just one virus or bacterium that was causing trouble. There were multiple. There was influenza, but there was also tuberculosis. TB would have made people susceptible to dying from influenza, especially since TB affected the lungs. Following an influenza infection, victims generally succumbed to bacterial pneumonia. This was caused when various bacteria moved deep into the lungs along a pathway of cells that were killed by the influenza virus. Among these destroyed cells were protective cells that served to move microbes and debris up and out of the body. The loss of these cells made the entire respiratory tract vulnerable to bacterial infection. And since TB outbreaks were around at that time, it was quite possible that TB would have increased the mortality rate significantly. It's kind of like the influenza virus did the invasion, secretly making its way into a host. TB bacteria were the ones that did the dirty work, either giving the host a hard time or killing them off. Finally, cytokine storms are considered a substantial biological factor for the deaths in 1918. To conclude, if World War I did not take place during the flu pandemic, people would have worked harder to fight the flu, making deaths significantly lower. But since the war occupied most of the world's attention, the flu silently made its way up to the stage. They also didn't have ICU ventilators at that time. Now that all of these factors have been identified, my hypothesis was correct. It could not have merely been the virus alone that caused 500 million deaths. Influenza was devastating because of environmental, political, social, and biological factors, all coexisting together to enhance the efficacy of the virus.